For most of my life, my faith was highly intellectual. I thought about God mainly from my head, and I knew Him mainly from the sermons that I listened to, the books that I read. And I come from a family full of theologians and pastors, so it was very common for me to, engage and talk about God. But I never really felt God. And a lot of times that made me feel very troubled. But at the end of the day, I was like, I just didn't feel anything. Yeah, and for me, God was this historical figure, this idea, a very powerful idea, but I would think of God as something to be studied about. So I never had a relationship with God. This was for most of my life until 2018 when something very drastic happened to me, and this was the year when my life completely changed. So this is the story of my transformation, and it started in the December of 2017. That's when I started getting strange illnesses, and I was constantly sick. And it first started with my nerves and my muscles. I was just in a lot of pain, like just out of the blue, there was just a lot of pain, and I felt like my muscles and my nerves had pins and needles that were flowing through them. And it was very difficult to even take a single step to walk. But all this while, I would look like I was perfectly fine. And there was so many things I was doing that time. So I would just not even tell people that I was in so much pain. I went to the doctors, but nobody could figure out what was wrong with me. My hair started falling off. My skin started developing a lot of rashes. And then the worst thing was when my stomach got affected. Everything that I ate, I would throw up the very next moment. It was like nothing could stay inside my body, and I would crave for food, but I knew that as soon as I eat it, I would vomit. And that was the most painful thing, because I'm a young 22-year-old girl, and I was like, I didn't know what was happening to me, and I felt like I was slowly dying every day, and nobody actually knew what was happening, and nobody could even help me. And by the time it was a couple of months, I had seen at least 9 to 10 doctors, but nobody could figure out what was wrong with me. In the month of June in 2018, I was called to participate in this global meeting of Christian leaders from all over the world. It was hosted by the World Council of Churches, and I was one of the young people chosen. Out of 20 young people all over the world, I was one of them chosen to participate in that meeting and help the organizers. But the night before I was about to leave, it was happening in Geneva, the conference. I felt really, really sick. I was already sick for the past few weeks, but I started developing this high fever. And by then, my body had started swelling up. My feet were swollen. And when I went, the doctor was like, "You have high fever, and this, like, a lot of things wrong in your body. You cannot travel, you cannot go on a 15-hour flight. You just have, in fact, you should be admitted to the hospital right now." But I was like, no, that's not going to happen. I need to go. Like, that's where I need to be. And then I traveled anyway. I was really happy that I could help and work with Christian leaders. And when I came back from Geneva, the very next day I was admitted to the hospital. The doctors told me that, your kidneys are very damaged. And within 1 day of staying in the hospital, my toxicity levels had just jumped incredibly. And I was thinking, like, how did my kidneys sustain so long? Back then I didn't even think of it as something that God was doing. And so I was in the hospital, and that's when my treatment started. I was diagnosed with systemic lupus erythematosus, or SLE, or commonly known as lupus. So lupus is basically an autoimmune disease, which means each of us have an immune system, right? And they are in our bodies to fight off infections and foreign particles. But in this case, my own immune system is attacking my healthy cells, my healthy organs, my skin. So that's when my treatment started, and I had to go through a lot of medications, and one of that was chemotherapy. And it was very painful, that process, because a lot of the medications were given very aggressively to me, and my body was changing. I was being put under steroid therapy, which completely changed the way I look. And so in my third round of chemotherapy, I was taken to the hospital, and it was around 5 hours of drips. Slowly the pain was starting to build up, and I was just taking painkillers, and I thought this will go away. And then after 3 days, I just took all my medicines, and that's when the pain like really exploded. It was like my heart was trying to rip itself out of my chest, and my body was just flopping around, and my knees were like terrible. They were like someone was trying to hit them with a hammer. They thought my bones were broken because of the level of pain, and so every 2 hours they had to give me a painkiller, because then I would just start screaming. So they would give me the medicine right before that the next episode started. At the end of the second day, my doctors told me, we can't give you pain medication anymore because you're going to overdose on your pain medication. We just have to see what's going to happen to your body. If it goes too extreme, then we'll figure out what to do. And at that moment, I was like, and the words of Jesus' prayer on the cross was just resounding in my mind, where he said, my God, why have you forsaken me? Because that's exactly how I felt. I was like, I'm not going to even get painkillers. That's how badly you have left me to go through this. And my mom and my sister, my siblings, everybody were like terrified. They were also really scared with me. But like, they gave me the last dose of pain medication, and then I went to bed. I fell into the deepest sleep that I had had since my treatment started. And then when I woke up the next morning, I just felt risen from hell, and I was back. And I just felt like Jesus had literally held my hand when I got out of bed and said, Talita Kum. That's the word he told to the 12-year-old girl that he raised from the dead. And I just knew at that moment that God had touched me. Like, I just knew. And that was very crazy for me, because for a person who thinks that God is just an idea, to know that it was so physical, to wake up like that and to feel like God had literally woken me up by the hand. It was also quite terrifying, because then I knew everything is true. Everything about God is true. And then I woke up, and I remember I posted on my Facebook, he raised me up to more than I can be. And that is how I felt that morning. And that was the moment that I really opened my eyes for the first time. That is how I felt. So the 3 days from when my pain started to when I was finally released from the hospital, those 3 days actually felt like I was sharing the suffering of Jesus Christ. And it felt like the pain was given to me. It's very hard to say this. It's very hard to say that God gives you pain. But it felt like I was given the chance to share God's suffering. I knew that that's where my salvation was, through those 3 days pain. And strangely, when I was admitted in the hospital that time, I had a lot of drips that were given to me through my veins. This particular time in the hospital, it gave me this scar which somehow felt like it was the greatest reminder that God had touched me forever. I'm a writer. I pride myself in the fact that I can write things and express things in writing. But for the first time, I felt like words were not enough to express how God made me feel. And it sounds crazy, but it's not like I'm hearing voices in my head or anything, but it was like there were words being put into me, and I would write more. And I wrote a lot of things that got published in like news websites and magazines, and I just felt like those words were not even my own words, that they were being put inside me. In 6 months, my doctor reviewed my condition, and he was looking at my reports, and he just looked at me and he said, "You are healing by God's grace." And I looked at him like, "Doctor, what do you mean?" He said, "No, you're already in remission. Your lupus is so aggressive, but you're already in remission." That really affirmed whatever it was that I was feeling. And I realized that being in communion with God was not just like a spiritual thing, that my mind is happy, my emotions are happy, but it was physically manifesting as well. Like God was literally working in my body. And the best doctor was telling me that. So the thing with lupus is, it's not going to go away. It is an incurable disease. And what I realized was that healing is not necessarily a cure the way we always think about it. Because now when I look at my life, and at that time I was actually healed in many ways. I was healed from all the brokenness I had even before lupus started. So at that time, it was just like this relationship that just blossomed with God. Because I loved God, I could really start loving people. Because even though I felt really close to God, there were times when it was always, it was a struggle in many ways. And my body was in pain, my mind was also troubled in many ways. But I remember just sitting under a tree and like looking at these two squirrels that were running up and down the tree, and I just asked God, all I want is a peace that passes all understanding. And the very next moment, I actually felt it. And after that, it felt like that was the only prayer that I ever truly wanted. That became the one prayer in my life that just solved everything. All I needed to do was ask for peace from God, and then everything else was given to me in a way. God makes sure that the things that I do without any self admiration, without any credit for myself, actually becomes the most rewarding thing for me. It was only after my sickness that my professional life really blossomed, and somehow finally all my different interests finally make sense as a whole. And moving forward, one of my greatest aim is to really take lupus awareness forward, especially in India, and to work with organizations and other activists so that people would not suffer like I did with this disease, and also to help a lot of people who cannot afford the kind of treatment that lupus requires, because it's a very demanding disease. And so that is one of my greatest aims. Now I finally feel that all of my interests and all the work that I do makes sense as a whole. And I know that if it could happen to me, who was so skeptical, so rational about God, I know that it can happen to you. I know that it can happen to anyone. I know that it can happen to someone who doesn't even believe in God. I'm Suzanne, and this is my story.